Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is our next webinar in our series of Topvrouwen.nl webinars on diversity and inclusion. And we're very pleased to have today with us Mrs. Sheila Patel, Goldman Sachs Asset Management Chairman, and Gerald Cartigny, Managing Director of Goldman Sachs Asset Management in the Netherlands. Gerald, thank you for being with us today. We're going to give the audience, which is a massive audience today, we're going to give them the opportunity to actually ask questions via the chat. But before that, I would like to first give the floor to you to tell a little bit more about Goldman Sachs before we give the floor to Sheila, and a little bit more about the activities you're actually pursuing here in the Netherlands.
Well, thank you, Marguerite. Great that you have us here. But on behalf of Sheila and also on behalf of my other colleagues of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, very much welcome on this webinar this morning. Thank you for taking the time. And we look forward to a very lively discussion. But when Marguerite and I, it was back in early days in December, we're discussing this actual physical event in April, which now turns out into a webinar. We got to the question is, why is Goldman Sachs interested in diversity and inclusion? And I think there are two things which I like to mention. First of all, Goldman Sachs believes that the business case for diversity and inclusion is incredibly strong. And I hope that Sheila is able to share some best practices, what we have seen in our firm, to share with our Benelux client base. And second, I got in my role in asset management the question, why is diversity and inclusion matters for asset management companies? And the second question is, if it matters, what is your influence or what is the impact you can achieve as a financial institution? And I'm sure that we touch upon these questions in this webinar as well. So with that, I look forward to a discussion. But I have to, unfortunately, I have to read out a disclosure before we start, but I promise I will do it quite quickly. So let me start with reading out. The contents of this call are not for distribution to the general public. Views and opinions expressed are for informational purposes only and do not constitute a recommendation by GSAM to buy, sell or hold any security. Views and opinions are as of today and may be subject to change. They should not be construed as an investment advice. With that, Marguerite.
Thank you, Gerald. So that's of course very well understood in the world of financial services. So Goldman Sachs, what is Goldman Sachs? Goldman Sachs is a firm which was established in 1868, so it's been existing for over 150 years. At the moment it has 40,000 employees around the globe. It has $2 trillion under assets in management. And the market cap, if I'm correctly, it's around 70 billion, and maybe a little bit less, but let's take $70 billion. A huge financial services firm with very impressive impact. And that's why it's even more impressive that they take the topic of diversity and inclusion very seriously. So with us today is Sheila Patel. She's chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Sheila is going to give us some more information around the activities of Goldman Sachs and why they actually feel diversity and inclusion is important, why they also took a very prominent stance earlier this year during the World Economic Forum. And especially in our today very complex operating environment before COVID, we were already being faced with a number of challenges, whether it was geopolitical situations, whether it was cyber, whether it was regulatory situations, gig economy. All these challenges were already ensuring that the operating environment of firms around the globe and people around the globe were actually challenging. To that, COVID-19 was added this year. And then you might wonder, how does COVID-19, how does that very complex operating environment, how does that relate to diversity and inclusion? And Sheila, thank you for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm going to give the floor to you to give us some more understanding of the importance of diversity and inclusion and the vision of Goldman Sachs and Goldman Sachs Asset Management on this topic today. Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. And in particular, I think I'm excited because of this topic in light of Diversity Day being so recent and the efforts that we have made that I'd love to share. I'm going to go through some slides quickly, and after I do that, we'll be off to the races on Q&A. But what we thought we'd share is a bit of the data. And to us, so much about diversity is about data, the reasons why diversity matters, both in investing and just in corporate culture. So we have a few slides. If we can flip to the first one on why diversity matters, you'll see opinions from a variety of sources. I think McKinsey's data in particular goes straight to the heart of it. There's above average profitability for companies that manage towards diversity as a key goal, as a key driver. We'll be sending this out, so I'll flip through pretty quickly, but everybody will get these slides, so not to worry if I move relatively fast. When we look at diversity, if you look on the next slide, you'll see some data that shows you a bit about how diverse teams perform. You'll find that diverse teams, diverse leadership teams, have higher innovation, right? They are showing, versus companies with below average diversity scores, a significant amount more revenue attributed to innovation. In particular, there's a difference in the likelihood of outperformance of first versus fourth quartile. If we move to the next slide on diversity and inclusion, you can see some of what we've done at Goldman to try to encourage diversity. The efforts we've made in our human capital management, as we call it, the way we think about talent, the efforts that we've made on having an inclusive culture. And I think that's so critical. Before we started this conversation, we were having a pre-conversation and talked about the population of Goldman Sachs. The average age of our employee is 29 years old. The vast majority of people are on the younger side. Most of them were in college or younger for the financial crisis. So when you think about diversity and inclusion, and yet having a global bank with the history that you mentioned, there is so much to think about, both in gender, but also in age, in every kind of ethnicity that we bring together across those 40,000 people, in culture, and of course, LGBTQ as well. So diversity to us is all inclusive. If we move to the next slide, you'll see some of our focus initiatives. I won't go through them one by one, but I've been very involved in a number of them, particularly Launch with GS, where we look for female founders and female entrepreneurs, but particularly women focused on investing. They make different choices, and those different choices lead, we hope, to sometimes better or at least diverse investments. And if we move to the last slide quickly, you'll see some of our aspirational goals. Our goals towards gender diversity, ethnic diversity, some of the ways we're trying to achieve those goals. For example, in the US, focusing on historically Black colleges and universities. So if you keep fishing in the same pond, you keep catching the same fish. And we want to make sure we're being as diverse as possible and as inclusive as possible. And so by changing the resources and the places we find talent, we hope to find diverse talent. And I'll stop there with the slides.
Yeah, a fabulous quote. If you keep fishing in the same
pond, you will keep fishing, the same fish. I love the quote. And your data is actually quite insightful, Sheila, because indeed Goldman Sachs has actually established some very important procedures and changes in the way you actually manage diversity in your firm. We'll come back to that later. But let's start with our first question. And we have also the opportunity for the audience. Please ask chat questions. You can put them in the chat so we can pose them to Sheila. We will do that at the end, but if there's something which is more tangible coming up following what Sheila is saying, we'll do that also in between. So please, any questions are warmly welcome. So the title of our webinar is a quote from you, and that's really interesting. It's being diverse is not an option, it's what we must be. And what led you personally, Sheila, to take this view?
When I looked at diversity and my history in this industry, I kept seeing talented people, a diverse group, and when we had that diverse group together, better results. And so every time you then try to take that and translate it to people, explain why it's important, they would always think you're trying to do something nice. oh, let's help more women get jobs. Let's think about caregiving. Let's think about things because we're good people. I really hope we are good people. But most importantly, we're good people driving good results. And so to me, we must be diverse because it is the best representation of all of our stakeholders, the clients we serve, the communities in which we work, the people, the colleagues who we spend so much time with, sometimes more time than we spend with our own families. If we can't appreciate the diversity in that and the ways that that drives outsized performance, we really aren't getting everything out of the community that we work in. And most importantly, aren't getting anything out of our businesses either.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, diversity is the one thing we people have all in common. If we would be all the same, life wouldn't be this interesting. And it's a very simple sentence, but it has a huge meaning, understanding behind it. So interesting, back to also, you mentioned McKinsey. McKinsey actually did a study in the Netherlands, and back to the numbers and data you're also relating and referring to yourself. McKinsey actually calculated that the uplift to the Dutch GDP would be 114 billion euros if we would use the potential of women better in our workforce. So that's an important number and also important data for the Dutch environment. Back to Goldman. So we've just seen also some of the data you were showing. And what does D&I mean to your organization? Why does it matter in particular? What impact does it have on your business performance or innovation?
Well, it's so fascinating, I think, because again, as you think about the part of the firm that I focus on, asset management, we focused on diversity, in particular, we focused on developing women portfolio managers, women investors. And in doing that, we were focused on just the opportunity set, but where we've ended up is seeing that 50% of the assets in our fundamental equity business and over 50% in our quantitative equity business are all managed by women. How did that happen? What are they doing differently? How do they think about investments differently? And I think that experience of finding the talent, focusing on the skill sets, but making sure you had a diverse group led us to put together investing teams that are just outperforming in a different way. And that's a super exciting result of having D&I at the core of what we do.
Yeah, so in the Netherlands, we've been discussing the importance of diversity and inclusion for multiple years now. Progress is improving, but still slow. We have therefore also, a law which will be coming into existence as from the 1st of January next year, which is being followed up by the Socio-Economic Council's advice. How can one accelerate progress? What's your own experience with progressing and accelerating diversity and inclusion in firms? What could be the tipping point?
Well, it's so interesting. I think people constantly struggle with whether things should be legislated or whether they can happen organically. And I think the reality we're coming to is a bit of both. If we don't put some muscle into change, if we don't give managers within companies goals and countries goals to give to companies, we don't end up with a set of parameters that make people feel that change is needed in the near term or that things have to happen. That said, many women, myself included, for example, don't love the idea of quotas because in many cases you feel that people will say, well, there's 2 women on the board because they had to do it. And that's why those 2 women are on that board, not the real reason, which is they add tremendous value, they're tremendously talented, and their skill set is so needed. So it's a balance. I think for us, what has helped us so much in our journey and what has gotten us to where we are today is the proof is in the pudding. The performance of women has been excellent. They are fabulous with clients. They're fabulous as portfolio managers. There's not a job in the company a woman can't do as well, and in many cases better than the guy next to her. So if that's the case, you'd be a fool to rule out 50% of the workforce that you could draw on.
Exactly. And so
we have also already questions coming in from the audience. Thank you for that. So one of them is the proof is in the pudding. How much diversity is actually on the highest level and positions in Goldman Sachs itself? Are you able to share some statistics with us on that?
Well, let's see. I'm trying to think of giving you the right stats. I can tell you that over the last few years, every year's promotion class of managing directors and partners has gone up a few percentage points each time in terms of diversity. We've had quite a bit of good results, as I mentioned, on the asset management side. And the statistics there certainly show our assets under management growing, particularly attributed to women portfolio managers. I would say, the other big change is if you look at our management committee, the most important committee of the firm, which I'm honored to sit on, the number of women on it has more than doubled in the last 5 years.
And it's very important. We always say one woman is no woman, so it's good to hear the voices of women, not only being heard, but also being received by the audience. Earlier this year, and already related to it, your CEO, David Solomon, actually, during the World Economic Forum, announced that he would no longer take companies public if they would fail to include at least one diverse board member, or at least 2 from 2021. So is that for you a low bar? And I'm also raising this in California, which might be interesting to straight away take this in as well. In California, end of August, there was another legislation change. California now also has said we want you also to include an ethnic minority on the board. So not only gender diversity, but also ethnic diversity. What's your call on this?
Yeah, look, I was fortunate enough to be at Davos with David when he made that announcement. And I can tell you, it wasn't an easy thing to do. Everybody didn't jump up and down and say, this is a great idea, it'll be so well received. But it was an important thing to do, in particular because it represented also our best advice. When we talk to corporations on the banking side, and we think about it on the asset management side, we see that companies with diverse boards perform better. Also seen, a list probably of IPOs over the last several years with companies that didn't have very diverse boards that haven't really done such a great job post-IPO. And so when we looked at this, we looked at it as first and foremost our best advice. Secondly, as a moment to take a stand and say this is something we believe in and we believe in it strongly enough that we'll make a commercial decision based on it. And lastly, to say we're here to help. And I think one of the most interesting things that we see on the asset management side that's replicated throughout the firm, banking, and as well as our merchant banking area, is many times companies give the answer that we can all sit here on this webinar and roll our eyes, but they'll say, we can't find any women. We don't know any women. I'd make the argument that they definitely have been fishing in the same pool too long. But if that's their issue, our answer and what we've done at Goldman is that we're here to help, right? We can criticize you, but not without a solution. We have a database we've assembled over many years of seeing talented women. You'd love to have a woman on your board, but you can't find one. Here's a list of 20, all of whom we think could be really interesting candidates. And we hope when we see you next time, you'll have more than one. And we've started to extend that to other areas of diversity as well, particularly with the social justice issues in the US today.
Yeah, so you actually, which I think is really,
putting your money where your mouth or your money is, and the other way around as well. So it's actually, you're actually helping firms to find new pounds to fish in, which I think is a very nice way to actually address this issue, because often we also hear that we can't find any women. That's also why we in the Netherlands have put a database in place, which actually now consists of over 2,500 board-ready women. So what's interesting also, you're also relating to the financial impact of investing in women, investing in firms where women are active, that it actually leads to more profitable results, actually very good results. And we've also seen in the Netherlands, and I would like to point it out also to the audience, that it's often very difficult to find firms who are investing in female entrepreneurs, startups or scale-ups. So in the Netherlands, we have some initiatives which are the Next Women and the Borsky Fund, which actually specifically focus on female-led enterprises to help them find funding. So that's a real good thing to make sure is also being mentioned today. So I think that you've already mentioned Black Lives Matter and ethnic diversity. We see that, if you take a look historically, when companies thought of diversity, a lot of attention went into gender diversity. We have also seen the past couple of months that diversity definitely covers a more broad spectrum. with Black Lives Matter and all other initiatives in that aspect. What's your focus as a firm on ethnic diversity?
Ethnic diversity is critical to us as well. And, in the slide I had put up earlier, I had given some stats on where we are. We have 11% of our population of professionals in Americas are Black. We'd like that to be bigger. Our goal is to have 7% of our vice presidents, so a promoted level, be in our Black population by 2025. We also are looking at our Hispanic and Latino population. We've also looked at how we can grow, maybe if you want to call it the particularly challenging area of gender diversity with ethnic diversity, where we see even less depth of talent in our organization that we need to grow. And so as we look at that, again, starting from the recruiting level, but we're also taking aim at it from lateral hiring.
Yeah, and so the question,
there's some coming in which I think is really interesting. So you've taken this very seriously forward, and you had the luck that your CEO David Solomon is a promoter of the diversity and inclusion strategy as well. But how long did it take? What did you do to get this accepted? How long did it take to get D&I really seriously accepted? And of course, I think the business case, you already related to the business case in your slides, but how do you yourself as Goldman, how do you use diversity as a criteria in your valuation of investments?
Sure. Well, I'd say, first of all, how do we get this going? It's actually something we've been writing about out of our research area for several years. So a woman named Kathy Matsui, who has led our Japan and really on a global basis our research on women in economies, had done tremendous work showing that if women fully participated in various economies around the world, it would make a huge difference to GDP growth. Well, it's a pretty simple mathematical exercise to say GDP growth equals growth for global banks. So from a mathematical perspective, if you believe the work that many people led by Kathy and our research team had done, then you would certainly look at it and say, okay, well, this is what will help drive a global growth. Therefore, this is something we should support as a bank that benefits from and engages in the values that come from that. But then how do you extend that into actual activity, right? I think one of the things that we've found, particularly, from an investing perspective, is that the focus on ESG has helped us tremendously in driving some of these goals. As you tried to look at governance, which is probably the first place global investors looked, asking about diversity on boards became a pretty easy question to focus on with companies. As the environment became, more of an issue, and as demand was coming through, not just from institutions, but also from the retail side, particularly from women who have the power of the purse increasingly in the investment sphere as well, you needed to be able to answer these questions well. And now that we've gotten through the pandemic and we see the toll that not having a holistic view of the communities within which a company works has a huge cost. If people can't have schools for their children, they can't make it to work. If people need caregivers, so much of that burden falls on women. Helping us understand and having women investors that viscerally get why these issues matter and why companies that address them well will outperform has been a huge benefit to us, and our portfolios have been beneficiaries of that during the pandemic.
Yeah. So we've seen indeed that the past months during the pandemic, the S from ESG has become a little bit more important, which is social. And I know that you've written actually that the growing focus of asset owners and regulators on environmental, social and governance is one of the biggest factors driving change in the way capital is invested today. So can you explain and elaborate a little bit more on this? And is D&I just as important as the other pillars?
Yeah, look, I think that S has become critical because people finally are able to define it. There's a famous quote that says, I can't tell you what art is, but I'll know it when I see it. And it's also used for pornography, right? So I can't tell you what the S is, but I'll know it when I see it is sort of where we ended up on the question of social, the S in investing. And then people, as they got into the pandemic and said, what companies will perform well if people have to work from home? Well, how do we figure that out? We ended up in our quantitative group, led by a woman, doing research on employee morale. And we found out that companies with the highest ratings on employee morale transitioned most effectively and their stock prices performed the best during a pandemic. Not only that, because their employees were in a good space and so able to transition their workload to home effectively, but when we back tested the factor, it turned out it had been true for the last 10 years, not just because of a pandemic. And so I think situations like this, not that anybody wishes for a global pandemic, but landscape altering situations make you look at the same data in a different way or make you ask questions that you never asked before. That helped define the S, that helped people understand why D&I is a critical question that they should be asking of companies in which they invest. And that helped drive performance, which is always the bottom line as an asset manager and an investor.
Yeah, sustainable finance is one of the new topics which is now really being paid more attention to how to actually drive that forward. And you've also said, until ESG can be measured in a consistent and transparent way, investors will struggle to measure the necessary metrics of progress. So you're related to data many times already today in our webinar, but what's the role for data within the context of this ESG evolution or revolution?
Yeah, look, I think it's such an interesting moment to talk about that, particularly with where you're sitting, because the European taxonomy is both looked at with huge excitement and anticipation for creating potentially a level playing field of data and a consistent set of data that we all as investors and as people involved in our society can use to compare companies and businesses on an equal footing. On the other hand, it's also viewed, frankly, with trepidation. Different regions have different views, are at different stages on their ESG and sustainability journey. And so maybe if asset managers try to apply the European taxonomy in Asia, maybe you'll have a lot more people worried than excited about the consistency of that data or whether it's the data that matters to them. So it's an interesting moment. I would say what's really important and what excites us about where we are on the data journey is that we're moving more and more from exclusionary processes where we just say, I don't want X or I don't want Y, to more thoughtful, holistic evaluation first. And second, even the ratings that companies are getting in the ESG space are moving from just getting a good grade because you showed up. In the US, they love to call it awards for participation. And so a lot of ESG grades right now and ratings are based on whether a company gives you any data in the first place, as opposed to whether the data actually shows that they're doing a good job, right? We're focused on data that shows they're doing a good job. And as a quick example, we worked with a European company, NL, on a bond issue. And so this is not in the asset management side. This is in another part of Goldman. And we ended up tying their coupon to their achievement of certain sustainability goals. And that was really exciting. It was an innovation, but it also was a message that said, look, you will charge us a higher rate for our debt if we don't accomplish our goals on sustainability, and we'll sign up for that. It's a tangible, measurable commitment that then you could marry off against the question of the results of that company. And it means that sharing their data will be critical to them and hopefully to others that try to do the same types of offerings and financings.
Yeah, so what's really interesting,
just to relate to the audience in a European context, the European Commission has just actually composed a sustainable finance platform. It consists of 57 participants. 7 are the huge overarching organizations like ESMA and IOPA. 50 other participants are all kinds of stakeholders, ranging from Bloomberg to Allianz. And what they're trying to do is to set a taxonomy in place which is consistent. The interesting point Sheila is actually raising, this is really tough because we're living in a global world. So what's important that we don't only do this in Europe, but that we try to take everybody along, so that we try to create consistency based upon which we can actually embrace sustainability. And interestingly, Sheila, remark from my end. I think it's always interesting if you hear the word sustainability. In some geographies, it's being referred to not as sustainability, but as future-proof. How can we make and how can we build a society, our business, our communities, with our employers, with all the stakeholders, how can we build a future-proof society? So back to diversity. So you have really huge ambitions on diversity and inclusion. And so can you give us a little bit a tip of what are the next ambitions on diversity and inclusion for Goldman? And what advice would you have to the audience present here today on how to achieve those, and what are the blind spots which you actually maybe encountered yourself while taking diversity and inclusion to next levels?
Oh, I don't hear.
Sorry.
Yeah, there we go.
I think in every country, we are trying to see more women CEOs. Would love to see that move quicker. We've actually just gotten the news of the first woman CEO on a Wall Street bank at Citigroup, so that's hugely exciting to see. But I think that's true in every industry. I think when you look at where we are today, particularly when you think about the next generation or people that might be participating on this webinar, I think what's really exciting is that we need to move beyond our definitions of diversity and inclusion and of the flip side of the coin, what needs to be improved for the next generation. It was very funny. My stepson is a lawyer, and he had to go through diversity training as he started at his firm. And what he said to me that I thought was so interesting was, most of what they taught us about or talked to us about never would have occurred to me to do. He was raised in a different environment. The women he went to university and law school with didn't accept some of the things that maybe a prior generation might have thought was okay. I don't know, but to him, he felt like he was being taught diversity lessons of what had gone wrong in prior generations versus probably the unconscious bias that he still has or that others still have for today. So I'm really excited to see what the next generation does, what the average aged person at Goldman Sachs drives us to, and to have them help us define what the right answers are in diversity going forward, as opposed to all of us defining it for the people just starting out in the business world.
Yeah.
So maybe to come back to the policies Goldman has put in place and then to ask some more questions around it, because I have one question which is about how do you keep women, because that's challenging. How do you ensure that your talent of women, that it's retained and that it's not floating out or flowing out to other firms? So Goldman has a policy to when you hire, and please step in if I'm not saying it correctly, Sheila, because you're the master of the universe here. So you have a policy that when you hire a graduate from university, there's a 50-50% hire. So there's 50% males, 50% females. So they start straight away from the beginning. They make sure that the starting point is the same. I know that you also in the selection committees have made sure that you have the right amount of diversities being represented on the selection committees. But how do you actually ensure that those female participants in their journeys towards on the ladder of their careers, that they are retained for Goldman? I understand your average age is 29, so at some end they might leave again to go elsewhere, but how do you actually manage those women and men? How do you make sure they retain with Goldman and that they're actually pursuing the careers they want to?
Yeah, retention is a huge issue for everybody, right? Because we care about our entire talent pool. But particularly when you think about women and you think about the developments that you want to have in terms of getting senior women into the business. If you don't hold on to them from the beginning, you'll be constantly churning at younger levels. I think mentorship, but particularly what I would call sponsorship, is important. And that's about somebody not just saying, I'm here for you to talk to once a month about your career or what might be important to you, but it's about somebody saying, I back you. I will fight for you when it comes to promotion. I will give you the inside line to tell you that you should make sure you're competing for an opportunity. I'll give you the tough feedback if I don't think that you're showing up in your all, at your best after a meeting, or if I see you do something that I think won't get you to the level that I know you want to be at. So being a sponsor and making sure, our talented women, but everybody that we have that's talented feels like they have somebody supporting them and behind them and giving them good advice, I think is critical. I also would just say the advice I give to women at Goldman and everywhere is help yourself. And that's been that's been some of my best advice to myself, which I don't always follow. If you don't raise your hand sometimes and say, I have ambition to do something more, or maybe you're at a moment in your life like I was, where I was flexible to move overseas. Sometimes people don't ask women the same questions they ask men, and that means you don't end up with the same opportunity set. Obviously, that's something we want to fix on the one hand, but on the other hand, if you're managing a lot of people, you don't always get to ask or to know what's in the mind of every person that works for you. So I always tried to be proactive. What are my goals? What are my capacities? What can I do? And you've set up a situation then when the person owes you an answer back as well. If I've done that, if I've been transparent about my goals, my capabilities, my flexibility, and I see a job go to somebody else, you will know that manager is thinking, I'm going to have to explain to Sheila why I didn't pick her for that.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to be responsible for that side of the communication bargain as well.
Yeah. So the question which
Straight away when you were telling your personal help yourself comment, so what was the determining moment in your career? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the path you've actually walked. And what was your determining moment? And did you indeed have a sponsor yourself who helped you at the determining moment to get that next step taken in your life, in your business life and your personal life?
Sure. Well, I certainly think one of the determining moments for me was after I'd been at Goldman, maybe 3-4 years, I was a partner, things were going well. I was based in New York. I saw a few people get opportunities I thought were really interesting, but they were outside the US. And what I said to myself was, does anybody realize that my family is portable, that we would consider moving? And so I went to my manager, who I was very close to, who really was, a mentor as well. But I also spoke with Lloyd Blankfein and Gary Cohn, and I just said, if anything interesting comes that's global, I'm flexible. I could go. Right? If it's the right opportunity. And lo and behold, within 6 months, there was the opportunity. I was still in the trading side then, trading division, securities. Then there was an opportunity to go to Asia to be co-head of the equities business there. And I'm not sure I ever would have gotten that opportunity if I hadn't asked. I'd say similarly, when I was in Asia during the financial crisis, and I thought that our growth plans and our strategy was set back by that, and I should be doing something different, I raised my hand again and I said, is this the job I should be in, or is there something else in the firm that could be, that could be better? And that's both how I ended up in London, but also how I ended up moving over to asset management. So it's always paid off for me to ask the question.
To pull this next question. So without any saying, the financial services it's now more and more female representatives are really walking up the career ladders to the top, but has been, especially with in our demographics, has been very male driven. How did you survive?
Well, it's interesting. I've thought about this a bunch, but something I did recently maybe is the answer. I'm not sure. But I recently did it was kind of a personality test kind of thing. It was actually meant for a bunch of high school kids, and I took it myself since I was going to be helping on coaching them with it, and it was finding your superpower. Well, lo and behold, my superpower was humor. And not till I did that did I realize that, I take everything with a grain of salt. I'm not overly serious all the time. I think that in many cases in the financial industry, over the last 25 plus years I've been in it, it's been incumbent on women to always be the most analytical, the most serious, the most driven. And I'm not saying some of those things aren't true, But if you let your humanity show a bit, it usually does some wonders as well, particularly for me, having a sense of humor and being able to have a joke here and there. It's been great because people are just disarmed by that, right? If they expect you'll just show up, spout a bunch of figures, be, driven and run away from a meeting, everybody else is sitting afterwards having a cup of coffee and laughing about whatever, laughing about something their kid did or just being a human. And I think that was too discounted and was really important to me.
So personal reflection from my end. I've actually learned how to separate business and personal. So I might simply disagree with a person. So I agree, I disagree, we disagree with a specific colleague. But I'm still able, after that business discussion, to have a beer with him or a cup of coffee if that's more appropriate. But the interesting part is that that's something where I personally always encounter that you need to make sure also yourself that you step out and be part of the ecosystem. Not only do your job well, but also run the ecosystem well. So Sheila, we have a number of questions, and I love this personal reflection for you. I'll come back to the personal reflections a little later, but we have a number of questions really relating to the business you're in. One of them is like, only 0.5% of venture capital is women. And Goldman Sachs, the question is, are you supporting emerging funds as well? Can you give us a little bit more information around that?
Sure. So actually, that initiative I quickly mentioned when we were flipping through the slides, Launch with GS, is specifically targeted at that. So we put up 300 million of our capital and have raised capital from outside institutions and investors, specifically focused on female-founded funds, with the idea that they would then find more diverse investments as well. What I think is really interesting about that question, though, is you need LPs, right? You need large institutions, large pensions, sovereign wealth funds. You need them to say this matters and step up and invest in these funds. And I had a great conversation with an institution in Asia about this. And I said, hey, we're doing this thing on Launch with GS. We'd love you to participate. It's about finding women-led VCs, women-founded funds, etc. And the short answer was, well, we don't do that. We don't do diversity as the reason we would make an investment. And I said, okay, do you do diversification as a reason you would do an investment? Because you constantly complain to me how some of the private equity and VC funds that you're in, you'll get one memo from one of them, the newsletter, that shows this great price they sold an investment at and how fabulous it is for the portfolio. And the same week you get the newsletter from their cohort down the road that says they bought it and what a great price they bought it at. And so you're investing with potentially funds that are just trading amongst themselves. Women-founded VCs and PE firms are just looking at different companies. They're looking at the value set differently. I think this is a global brand, so I think a lot of you will know Spanx, right? But it's a women's garment to wear, right? Or something, which I can't say is enjoyable, but certainly is popular. It's a $1 billion+ business. The founder of that business couldn't get funded by a single VC fund because no guy could understand what a woman would have to wear under a ball gown, much less invest in it. And yet her business was on one of the sharpest trajectories you could find. So if you take it to an investor and to an institution as that message, it changed immediately. He said, oh, I would look at that. That I would look at. Just don't call it about investing in diversity. Call it investing in diversification. I said, okay, whatever you like.
Yeah, that's a very good advice. So there's also a question, and so please ask questions via the chat function. I really like this one as well, because this is, we have companies who are short-term focused and companies that are long-term focused. So what would be your advice to companies who are often maybe more short-term focused on this specific topic of diversity and inclusion? You already mentioned diversification, so I think it's a very strong message, but I just want to pose this question in addition anyhow, just to make sure that we've rightfully understood.
Sure, and look, I think that a short-term focus obviously is something we don't generally encourage in asset management anyway, but that's the reality, right? That's the reality, particularly if people are very focused on moves in the stock market and a company maybe is trying to transform itself or whatever it might be. What I would say is a company needs to look even in the short term at its core values and how it achieves its mission. And whether that's a consumer company trying to make sure that as we head towards the holiday season, usually the fall is a time when many of those companies have their best sales, and yet in the period of COVID, how will they do that? Or whether it's an industrials company or a car maker, what are they trying to get done, and how does diversity play into it? And I think if you ask the question the right way, even in the short term, you find out that it matters a lot. I mentioned earlier, women control the purse strings on a lot of purchases. They certainly control a lot when it comes to car buying in every country. They control a lot when it comes to what their children consume and all the rest. So if you don't have diversity on your team, how do you think you'll win in any of those industries? Similarly, if you think about, again, in the short term, trying to show accomplishment, I think companies can take baby steps, right? It's not just a question of what percent women or what percent diversity by any metric are you from year to year. It's also just who led a really important project. Is there one really important project this quarter that you could have led by a more diverse team and see what difference it makes?
Yeah.
Right.
So there's another
question. I'm just going to raise some of the questions, which is about, and this one I like as well, because it's, of course, we are in a stage of transformation, transitioning on D&I. It's an important topic. It's on the boardroom agenda more and more, just like sustainability. The question is, if you as an asset manager analyze companies, are you also looking at the transformation of D&I in a company? And how do you look at it? Because we've talked about, the fact that there should not, IPOs, which with your managers' boards, we should have more diversity. But do you also look at the transformation of D&I overall in the culture of a company? And if so, how do you assess that?
Absolutely. So I think it's a great question, and it's one that's tied into the data question as well, because it's something we're trying to do within our stewardship team. Stewardship is really the area of most asset managers where the rubber meets the road in terms of meeting the managements with whom we invest, asking them about their company and telling them what matters to us, what we want to see them doing. We say to every single company we meet with, what is the diversity of your board? If it's not diverse, we voted even before ISS recommended it against their nomination committee, because we said they're not doing a great job. They haven't come up with a diverse board. Now we also say, what's your challenge? Why can't you have more diversity? Here's our database of women to make that change. And we're starting to ask, what's the diversity within your company? What is not just gender, but all types of diversity? How do we get the data to know about where diversity sits? As in, are you actually developing people towards leadership roles? Or is it all just your undergrads where you started out, you get good numbers, and then, as you asked earlier, you're not retaining them, you're not developing talent? And so we're asking those questions, but we're not happy with the state of data for the answers. That means every company we ask can give us the stats in a different way, answer it a different way. But it is part of our scorecards, and we have shared scorecards with 30 plus metrics on them that we look at, including several D&I metrics that we share across all asset classes within the asset manager. And it's something we've been building and we continue to try to extend. So it's both that one-to-one with the management, but it's also a huge struggle for data.
Yeah, so the huge
data is something which is really very important. So even in the Netherlands, we're now working towards our law. And the law will establish 30% quota for women on non-executive boards, but is also going to have a duty of obligation for the 5,000 companies to follow to actually make sure there is a D&I strategy. And the Socio-Economic Council is actually looking at how to establish and gather those data, how to aggregate those data, And interestingly, one of the examples we're looking at is the Australian model. They have an organization, public organization, which is actually gathering all that data every year. It's like a tax, every year we have to fill in our tax forms. Every year in Australia, they're filling in their D&I standards. And the question which is raised on this as well is, like, do you also take a look at gender pay gap? So we've discussed various D&I policies. Do you look at gender pay gap? Have you ever had your personal observation on the gender pay gap within Goldman? How does it work?
Yeah, in the UK and other places where it's starting to emerge when it comes to gender pay gap. I'd also say, we signed on to the UK initiative around financial women in finance, and basically the development of women in finance. And I think, if I remember right, it was Her Majesty's Treasury that initiated that, but I'd have to double check. But we were a signatory there as well. And we do look at it. I think one of the challenges on pay gap analyses and on some of the analyses like that, they go to the point I made earlier. What's the nuance, and how do we think about things that are enforced versus things that grow organically? And we'd like to see both. Gender pay gap was designed in most cases, particularly the UK version with which I'm most familiar, for broad organizations that have a large workforce all at a similar level, right? And so you think about, a large retailer or a manufacturer, and you'll get a very different data curve, basically, than you get in things like the financial industry, right? And so I do think that it's a good blunt force instrument for question number 1, but we find a lot more value in questions 10 to 20 about how are you growing your talent pool at each level of seniority, and then how are you compensating people at each of those levels? Because a little bit of data can throw the whole analysis off when you're just trying to compare very diverse industries.
Yeah, very, very insightful. So I have 3 questions, and we're going to try to do them very quickly. The first one is, and if you can answer it by one word or one sentence, the single most important thing the crisis taught you. What's the single most important the crisis taught you?
I don't know if I've learned it yet, but my patience is better with technology.
Very good.
Learn
Okay.
you can't have everything instantly, and you have to slow down. And especially during some of the lockdowns, I think we all learned to just take a deep breath.
Exactly. Now, yeah, working from home.
Something which is, I can do it. I've learned that, I never believed I could do it because I was always in the office and never at home. So back to a lockdown. So Sheila and I talked before this webinar, and I advised her that, the seriousness about COVID-19, it's increasing again in the Netherlands, which is very unfortunate. It might actually, hopefully not, but we might be forced with another lockdown. We call it an intelligent lockdown, Sheila. But do you have an advice of a book we should read during that lockdown if we're being forced not to be able to see each other anymore? What's the book, one book you would say, okay, take it up and read it? This is an advice.
Well, I'm a big science fiction fan. So there is a book called The Fall of Dodge by a very well-known science fiction writer named Neil Stephenson. It's the second in a series. It's great if you read both, but if you just read this one, I really enjoyed it. And it's basically about the constant quest to kind of live forever and what happens if you really end up working that out.
I'm a big Star Wars fan. So I will say to you anyhow, before we're going to close down in 1 minute, may the force be with you from Yoda. That's one which is definitely personal for me to you. So the last question, I thought this was a hilarious question, because for me this is, if you talk about the proof is in the pudding, and I'm going to ask it you, and then I'm going to give the floor back to your dear colleague Gerald. So this is like a question, maybe it's rhetorical, maybe you don't even need to answer it, but do you think David Solomon will allow a woman, maybe will allow you, to step in his footsteps?
I think he will. I think that, he actually just did an amazing thing with seeing a colleague of mine and a tremendous woman named Stephanie Cohn become co-head of our newly formed consumer division. And so, that was pretty exciting to see. And I think he's focused on it. So I'm sure that will be in our future.
Yeah, so
before I'll turn it back to Gerald, Sheila, I want to thank you so warmly for being here with us today. Indeed, Gerald already related to the fact we were supposed to see each other early in the year live, but that didn't happen. It's been a tremendous pleasure to have you with us. Also, the honesty with which you actually answered the questions we were quite openly raising to you was astounding. Thank you so much for being with us today. On behalf of all of Topvrouwen.nl, on behalf of Caroline Holtgreven, our director, on behalf of all the women represented in the call, but also outside the call, who will be for sure listening to the webinar with great interest. I'm going to ask you one last question. What would be your advice to all of us on the topic of diversity and inclusion?
Well, certainly point number one is don't give up, right? Because I think it's very easy at times to look at individual situations and say, this is hopeless. It's not. I think we're at the most hopeful moment ever. And second, because I'm going to take two, the second is let's learn from the youngest among us. I've been so inspired by what I've seen from the women coming in from university. They don't take any garbage. They're on it. And again, it's easy to get worn out or worn down or say, well, certain things won't change. It'll take some time or whatever it is. Even though I said patience was the skill set I learned, that was with technology. That wasn't with diversity. With diversity, we won't stop being impatient.
Now, thank you so much. For me, what's really standing out today is if you keep fishing in the same pond, you'll keep fishing the same fish. So we need to go into other ponds, which I think is a very strong message today from Sheila Patel. Gerald, thank you so much for being the most tremendous host. I also would like to thank Microsoft. Once again, we are in the offices and the studio of Microsoft. Thank you so much for the hospitality here today. Gerald.
Yeah, thank you, Marguerite. Let's first have a thank you to our participants who have spent almost 60 minutes with us. Thank you for that. You have asked so many questions. I flipped through them, but we were impossible to have them ask all. But we will definitely send them over to Sheila and see what we can, whether we can answer them somehow anyway. I'd like to thank Topvrouwen, Marguerite, but also Caroline for the hard work you put into this. I know this was postponed and delayed, but you were patient, we were patient, so eventually it paid off. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Keep up the good work with Topvrouwen. You're doing a great job. And then for me, I will close with the closing disclosure, which I've been asked from legal department to read out to you. And then I wish you all a pleasant day, and thank you for joining. So the closing disclosure is just as a reminder, this call is not for distribution to the general public. Views and opinions expressed are as of today's date and are for informational purposes only. They do not constitute a recommendation by GSAM to buy, sell or hold any security. Thank you again for joining and a pleasant day.
Tot ziens, tot Topvrouwen.